Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog.
This episode is brought to you by Gauge. Gauge is a free and open source test automation tool by ThoughtWorks with a goal of taking the pain out of test automation for acceptance tests. To help with this, Gauge supports specifications in Markdown, which are easy to read and easy to write. Reusable specifications to simplify your code, which makes refactoring easier, and less code means less time maintaining your code. And finally, integration. Use Gauge with your favorite tools and IDEs in the ecosystem of your choice, like Selenium and Sahi Pro, CI and CD tools like GoCD, Jenkins, Travis, and IDE support for Visual Studio, VS Code, IntelliJ, and more. Head to gauge.org/JSParty to learn more and give it a try. Once again, gauge.org/JSParty.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of JS Party, where every week we throw a party about JavaScript and the web. This is KBall, one of the JS Party panelists and changelog correspondents. I was in Carlsbad, California, just a few weeks ago for JSConf US and had the chance to talk with some amazing people. In today's longer than normal but packed with great content episode, I first talked with Michael Chan, aka Chantastic. We covered a range of topics, including how to start speaking at conferences, how your Twitter handle is really your rapper name, why we may be overemphasizing the value of dry code, and the importance of metaphors we use to cover software development. So you gave a talk yesterday.
I did.
That I saw and greatly enjoyed.
Thank you.
Do you want to tell a little bit about what you spoke on so that our listeners can hear about it?
Absolutely. So the talk had a little bit of a clickbaity title. It was called Hot Garbage, Clean Code is Dead. And it's kind of hard to summarize, but the idea is that we've started to fetishize certain aspects of clean code. And I think that in some ways we've forgotten what the heart of clean code is, which is to keep things changeable, keep things tidy so that when things inevitably need to change, we can change them easily. And we all have that experience where it's very hard to change something. And this is when we get angry. We look at our screen and we're like, who was the last idiot that did this thing? Because it's not going to be able to do this thing, and it's going to be really hard to change and whatnot. And sometimes it doesn't matter if it was someone we hate or someone that we like or ourselves like an hour ago. We just have this thing in us where it's like, because we can't predict the future, we're angry about the present that we're in. And I think that we just keep thinking that there is some type of magical clean code enchantment that we'll be able to do that will save us from that problem. And the talk is mostly just about the idea that 90% of the job is just kind of slinging code around, moving it from here to there and the other place. And clean code won't save you from that. It's just part of the job that we come in, we find something that doesn't meet the new requirements. We couldn't have predicted the future, so that's the way it's always going to be, and now we have to change it. And we can be angry about it or just accept it and move on with our life.
Yeah, one of the things I loved that you talked about in that talk was around how we have this obsession with dry code. Don't repeat yourself.
Yes.
Cut it down. And that is great when you have mature code that is no longer changing very rapidly.
Yeah.
But dry code is also not very pliant code. It's rigid and fragile in some ways.
Yeah, it can be a liability, right? If you have very dry code that, if you prematurely dry out your code, and you don't know everything about what could possibly be added or changed about that feature, so many times you're just going to have to hydrate it back up again to make sense of it, and then redry all those abstractions out. It's so funny because don't repeat yourself has nothing to do with the how much moisture is in code, right? But it does end up being a very good analogy. The analogy carries through really well in terms of the experience of what it feels like to work with dry code.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you have a pot right? You can't, once you dry it out, like you're done.
It's that thing
there.
forever.
And sometimes that's what you want. And one of the reasons that don't repeat yourself is great is that it does create, as you mature a system, it gets you out of this problem of, oh, I've got this bug in one place, I have to fix it in 10 and moves down. But when you are in that stage of rapid iteration, it's painful.
It can be really painful. One of the misconceptions about the talk, and I think something that I've had to convince a couple people out of, is that I have no intention of saying that the practice of clean code is dead. I think that there are aspects of clean code that are really good. It's just that the context is critically important in determining what are the best rules to apply in this situation. So, dry is really great, as you said, with code that is known. It is really good not to repeat yourself in situations where you're using the exact same piece of, or the same concept, right? But clean code can often lead to things that are harder to work with. And it's not that clean code, the practice is dead, but clean code often more resembles like a dead thing. Like you said, like a pot. You totally dry it out and now it's a pot for forever. And you have to be really dramatic sometimes about how you change that into something else. Like you have to break it down into, whatever pots are made out of and then kind of make it a new thing again. And I think we feel that in code a lot sometimes.
Definitely. Well, and I think another big idea, because we talk so much about generalization and drying things out and making things super clean, and these are worthy things to aspire to, but we often do it prematurely.
Yes.
Especially folks who are kind of just getting into the industry and haven't felt this pain over and over and over again. I like to say, make it once. If you need it again for something else, make it again.
Make it again.
If you need it for something else, by the time you're on your third time, you might know enough to start generalizing it. But don't try to generalize it when you've just made it in one example or two.
Yeah, I use this example a lot where you need a modal for something. Like, let's say you're making a person edit modal. And I don't know why, but we never go for just building the one thing that we need. You never sit down and type in make new file person edit modal.js, right? And that's a more pragmatic way to think about it. I'm making this thing. I'm going to make it as specific as possible. And then we'll determine the general aspects of it later.
Right.
We always go, I need new modal.js. And think that has the potential to maybe stand the test of time for whatever reason. And it almost never does. We're almost always wrong.
I am creating a person modal, and therefore I will create the ideal platonic modal that will stand the test of time throughout the entire lifetime of my application.
Yeah, and sometimes that moment where you have to break the pot down and kind of remake clay out of it is like a rewrite, right? And those are just, I don't know. I'd prefer to do small rewrites all along the history of my app or all along the life of my app than one big rewrite that we have to get right at that point in time for the rest of time.
Yeah, if you do a massive rewrite, you often lose a lot of embedded knowledge.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Edge cases, corner cases, all this sort of thing. There's another thing. I also fall in that camp. I tend to advocate against from the ground rewrites. And if you're going to do it a piece at a time.
Yep.
Carefully.
Yep.
Scope it. Make sure your interfaces are clean so that you can try out your piece by piece rewrites and not lose all of that hard-won knowledge that's embedded in the code.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we don't think about rewrites granularly enough, as you're saying. It makes a lot more sense to rewrite things piece by piece. And I think when you've been around a lot, especially if you've been in the same code base long enough to have replaced your own work, you start to realize that in some ways everything is a rewrite. And if I get in the habit of rewriting smaller chunks as more is revealed about our customers, about the product that we're making, you get better at doing those small rewrites, and it becomes less attractive to do a top-down rewrite. You kind of just identify hey, this thing has continually been a big pain in the butt. Let's just rewrite this part of it and know that next time it'll be a little bit easier to change the whole.
One thing that you also touched on in your talk that I think is really applicable to this is this question of where are we drawing our metaphors from?
Yeah.
We use a ton of language in software development that derives from traditional physical construction.
Yes.
We talk about architecture. We talk about
engineering, development.
Exactly.
We use frameworks and scaffoldings and all kinds of things.
Like our language is embedded in this world where you create things once.
Yep.
It's got to stand the test of time. You have to do all of this upfront planning, and it's also something that we know pretty well because the technologies have been around for thousands of years, and maybe they've changed a little bit, but
you're still using 2x4s to frame a house.
Exactly. Like if you use the same tools. If you're in the JavaScript world, like your tools change every 6 months practically, right? It's not the same type of thing. And so perhaps another metaphor would be useful. And I liked your idea of making it a more organic metaphor.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that idea of rewriting. I was thinking about things that are repeated, and I was thinking about the fact that our apps aren't like something that you build up, you plan out. And this is my experience. I know that a lot of apps are still built in kind of a traditional, we're going to build this thing for 6 months. It's going to get, sent out. We have this big release once a year, and a lot of software is still built like that. But I think a lot of web applications are built in a totally different way, where we put something out and then we hear what customers have to say about it, and we change it pretty quickly, like sometimes immediately. And that is one of the beautiful things about what we do is we have this really tight feedback loop with our customers. But sometimes I think emotionally, we still write code as if we need to get it right on day one, and that because that's going to be in production in that way for a year until the next release comes out. And I think for a lot of apps, we have the benefit of being able to be wrong, see what happens, and then fix the mistake later and actually have our customers love us for it. And so I've started to think about how that's a little bit more, like farming. There's a seasonality to it. There are unknowns, like the weather plays a lot into what we were able to deliver to our customers. Customers shape the type of products that we create and get good at. And the fact that, living things don't always do exactly what we expect them to do. We kind of, sometimes they push back on us a little bit, and the harvest isn't as good one year as opposed to another. And I have really been enjoying personally this idea that I come to work and I'm going to kind of wrestle with the app that day. And the weather might not be as I like it, and the response of this living thing might not be quite as I like it, but my work is just to keep at it, to keep coming, knowing the conditions are going to be different every day, and just keep trying to get the best thing out of this product as I can.
Yeah, and the additional fun metaphor that you had on there was, well, sure, a lot of code is crap code, but what's the best fertilizer? Right?
Crap.
Right? Well, and in another way of thinking about that, right? Organic matter uses broken down organic matter to grow and to become better, right? Like the lessons that we learn writing this bad code and experiments, things like that really does improve the outcome as we go. So there's, it's a little bit of a fun stretch, but I think there's some truth there.
Yeah, and I think that idea that you touched on, the idea of decomposition, is really important. We like to think about creating things and building things up. Like that's the fun part. But we don't often think about how things break down again or come out of our app. And sometimes knowing the end helps us start better. And knowing that, hey, at some point, this is going to get pulled out, or it's going to get replaced, or the framework that we use today is not going to be the framework that we use in 5 years. So how do we keep things that matter around? How do we continue to, I'm not going to go too deep into the farming metaphor. I was tempted there for a second, but how do we keep good things around and kind of let bad things, fall off? And I think there are so many ways to do that, but I think sometimes I'll go into a couple, but like one of them is, testing. I think sometimes we get really deep into the weeds and, in testing, and we forget that the tests that are going to stand the test of time are the ones that are closest to the user. The ones where we say, like, the user needs to click this button and expect that this thing happens. And the implementation can churn as much as it has to, as long as that end result is the same, as opposed to kind of like the closer you get to the code and away from the user, I mean, you can be changing tests almost as much as you're changing the code. And that is a very frustrating way to live.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I didn't get too practical in the talk, but one of the things that I talk about is how to identify code that is ripe for a refactor or a rewrite. And I borrowed this from Sandy Metz, but she was saying that there's a graph. A lot of code quality products show this to you. It might be hidden in some, but I know things like Code Climate has this, a churn versus complexity graph. And it looks at each file, determines how complex it is, how many kind of logical trees there are in it, and takes that score and then says, how often are you actually touching this? How often are you making changes to it? And if you have high complexity, but there's no churn, like the file might look like a mess, but it's hardworking code and you don't have to, it's not costing you money regularly to make changes.
Right.
And then the inverse is true too. If you have a lot of churn, but there's no complexity, well, that's actually great because it means that you are able to change it rapidly. And what you're looking for are the outliers where churn and complexity are both very high. Those are the ones that are regularly costing you money. And when you're frustrated, that's kind of a reasonable frustration.
Right. And those are good places to look carefully at how can I refactor this to be simpler.
Yes, absolutely. That's where you're going to see the most benefit. And I have found that using that has really clarified a lot of my conversations with managers. So it's less this like, oh, well, you just don't want me to, have a clean place to work. And more like, hey, this is the data on this thing. We're changing this thing a lot because we obviously don't know what we're building yet. So it would behoove us to make it simpler to work on. I'll be able to turn these things around faster for you. And I mean, any PM worth their salt is going to hear that and say like, oh, well, yeah, I want you to work faster. And if this is the way to get it done, like, let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that as a way of kind of taking this and quantifying it for folks who perhaps aren't able to feel the pain of working in a messy code base. And if we're honest with ourselves, like that's where we are feeling the pain. It doesn't matter how ugly it is to look at if we never have to touch it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you talked about being able to change out frameworks and things like that, but you're also, sounds like, very focused on React with the podcast. So what's your thought? Is React going to continue to dominate, or are we going to be throwing it out in 3 or 4 years and putting something new in? Yeah,
so Laurie Voss gave a really awesome talk at this year's JSConf, and he was talking about all the data that they have at NPM and the things that they're learning about these open source projects. And he says that every popular framework, has about kind of a 5-year lifespan, or a 5-year heyday, right? And React is about in like 3.5, 4 years into that adoption curve. So it's really unknown how long React will be able to sustain this. It is interesting. Some of the interesting facts about React are that it is on multiple platforms, and so that is kind of unprecedented up to this point. The fact that you can use these components and target, web, canvas, native, electronic, like that ability is a new thing. So that's very cool. But he also posed the idea that it's very possible that this, in the way that jQuery kind of proved this concept of document selectors, might also be able to prove this concept of what a first-class component should look like on the web. And if it's able to borrow his language, transcend into the browser, it is possible that we could be using React for a really long time, or some inspired by React way of writing native components.
Yeah, I mean, that component-oriented architecture, whether you're using React or not, all of the modern frameworks have essentially consolidated to component-oriented architectures with component life cycles and some sort of state management solution, often inspired by the Elm architecture or Flux architecture.
Right.
And you see that's now there in React, but it's also there in Angular. It's also there in Vue. It's also there in Ember. It's now there in Dojo. I could just keep going on and on and on. All of these different frameworks are adopting that because it is such a phenomenally useful abstraction for front-end development.
Yeah, the key innovation of React was how to create an isolated component. And it's amazing how far that spread.
Absolutely. So you mentioned something to me, and we talked a little bit about it earlier, about our Twitter handles becoming essentially our wrapper names. I kind of want to go in on that idea a little bit in terms of the personalities that we assume to engage in the sort of broader tech community. Because if you think about a wrapper name, that is putting on a persona.
Yes.
And I'm not a rap expert, but I don't know. Ice Cube is not the same person as whatever the heck his actual name is, right? That is his rapper persona that he is putting out there.
I heard someone put it Madonna isn't walking around her house in a cone brassiere.
Right.
There is a facade in front of the person that is the character.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's value to that, right? It can create a separation. It can create, give you the ability to, both for positive and negative, but I think I'm focusing more on the positive, to put yourself out there in ways that you, the underlying person, might not be comfortable with at all.
Yeah.
And one of the themes that came up at JSConf when we were doing our live episode is everybody wanted to know, how do you become a speaker? That feels like a big barrier.
Yeah.
And you've started your own podcast and things like that. So how has becoming Chantastic rather than Michael or Chan, how has that changed your self-perception and ability to kind of put yourself out here?
Man, that's a great question. So I am deeply inspired by this book titled The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. It's an amazing book, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who is embarking on a creative endeavor. And not creative as in art, but creative where you are creating something. It is an amazing book, but he talks about the ability to separate you, and I think he calls it you Inc. This idea that no matter what you do, you need to be able to think, to separate you, the creator of the work, and you Inc., the marketer of the work. And honestly, even to be able to just establish a value for the work that you're doing. Because a lot of times, anytime, for those of us that are freelancers or doing creative work, we have such a hard time putting a value on it, putting a number on it and asking for a fair wage.
Yeah, it's deeply uncomfortable to
go
and say you should pay me $10,000 for this project. In the back of your head, you're going, what? And this is, as I gotten into consulting and things like this, most of us, and I think it's not just this industry, most of us worldwide have hangups about money and self-promotion and asking for things. And you can't have that if you're going to run your own.
You cannot. You have to be able to create that fracture in yourself to be there's me and I am kind of insecure about what I do, and I know all of my own warts and what it took to get here, and there's me Inc., which is a baller and is going to ask for what I need to make ends meet and more. Yeah. I mean, and you'd be amazed when you start experimenting with that, because you'll ask somebody, you'll have a number in your head, and then you're I gotta ask for more. Okay, I'm gonna do this because I'm gonna give them two options. So then I don't feel too bad because they can always go to the bottom one, right? So I'm gonna give them my number, and then I'm gonna give them my number plus 50%, right. And they're oh, is that all? Okay, cool. Yeah. It's just it's shocking every time. You're I wouldn't hire myself for that much. But yeah, I think that man. So back to your speaking question, I got into this industry after being laid off from my accounting job and being on unemployment for 6 months. And I was like, you know what? I never want to feel that way again. And so for me, it was kind of this opportunity to chase after a little bit of security, to be able to not just be a developer, but one with videos where I have like a well thumbed up talk on YouTube with my own philosophies and the way that I think about things. I wanted to put all of that out there so I could have friends in the industry and meet cool people. And I think my desperation to gain that comfort way outshadowed my shame in feeling like I didn't have anything to say or whatnot. And I'm constantly amazed every time I go to a conference. I'm sitting in that speaker room with people that I have admired for a really long time, and they're all stressing out about having to give a talk.
Yep.
And it's so humanizing. I want everyone to give talks because I think everyone has something to say, but more than anything else, you need to sit in that room with your heroes and feel their stress when they're trying to talk to you. It's invaluable. Everyone should talk. Everyone should talk.
Yeah. Well, and we talked in the JS Party, the live episode that we did here, about kind of what does that take? Like, how do you apply to a CFP? How do conferences pick their speakers and stuff? So if you're listening to this and you're curious about that, go listen to that episode.
Absolutely. It'll be super helpful for you.
And you put yourself out there. Maybe if you're having trouble and if you're struggling, maybe you need a rapper name.
You need a rapper name. You definitely need a rapper name. If your Twitter handle is just your name, you need to change it.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Rollbar. How important is it for you to catch errors before your users do? What if you could resolve those errors in minutes and then deploy with confidence? That's exactly what Rollbar enables for software teams. One of the most frustrating things we all deal with is errors. Most teams either A, rely on their users to report errors, or B, use log files and lists of errors to debug problems. That's such a waste of time. Instantly know what's broken and why with Rollbar. Reduce time wasted debugging and automatically capture errors alongside rich diagnostic data to help you defeat impactful errors. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow. It integrates with your source code repository and deployment system to give you deep insights into exactly what changes caused each error. Give Rollbar a try today at no cost to you. No credit card is required. Our listeners get access to the Bootstrap plan with 100,000 events for free for 90 days. To get started, head to rollbar.com/changelog.
In this next interview, I spoke with Juan Pablo Buriticá and Julián David Duque, two of the founders of JSConf Colombia. We discussed their experiences starting a JavaScript conference in Latin America, the incredible flourishing of the JavaScript and web community throughout the world, and ways for those of us who are privileged enough to work in this space to create privileged bridges to share those opportunities and our favorite language, JavaScript, with those all around the world. So the two of you are doing a tag team talk. You're working together. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, sure. We have been working together since 2011, helping build an amazing community in Colombia, and also defining like a framework of how other communities kind of start like working, following the same model. We want to tell the story about the community we have built in Colombia, what we have learned, all of the challenges, all of those beautiful and rewarding moments that you can like see when you see the results and the impact that the community is making. So we want to share that part of our lives with the JSConf family.
Right. So just how you see here that we are at a conference surrounded by people who are awesome and love building stuff and love software in JavaScript. It is an experience that is limited to a few folks. And we set out to expand that experience or like make it more accessible to folks particularly in Colombia, with the hopes of building a community that would be sort of self-feeding and would grow and eventually we would export our experience. We would tell other people how we did it, and we would have these Colombian ambassadors all over the world speaking not only about like Colombian technology, but also about JavaScript. And 8 years in, we have seen some pretty good results, and we want to share some of the learnings we've had.
So this won't go out until after the talk. So can you give us a sneak peek of what you're going to talk about there? Like, what are the things that you've seen?
Absolutely. So the title of the talk is called the butterfly.js effect. Julián, what's the butterfly effect?
So the butterfly effect says that something as small as a flap of a butterfly on the other part of the world can cause an hurricane on this side of the world. So we want to show that our little efforts or the things we have done in the past with the community have impacted others, and we have created like something massive that it's way bigger than us, and there is like more than 50,000 people involved in this huge community. So it has been pretty much what we are going to talk, and it has been like an amazing experience to be part of this community.
As ambassadors, we may have started some of these efforts. We don't take the credit for any of it, but we want to represent. We want to make sure that it is visible, and that folks in venues as important as JSConf US see this work, and hopefully this message goes to folks in other communities that are not tech hubs that want to get access to this knowledge and can get motivated and inspired to start this in their own places, whether it's some rural town in middle America or a remote town in the middle of the Andes.
That's amazing. So 50,000 people now involved in one of these things that started from your idea.
Yeah, it's a collection of meetups. Not all of them are associated, but what we've tracked now is that there's over 50,000 people related to each other in different cities in Colombia that come together to talk about software. And
we have a centralized place when we have like the most active members of those communities, their leaders, organizers, and it's a good way to start seeing how not only the cooperation and collaboration between JavaScript communities all around one nation, but other different technologies how can learn from each other. Like we collaborate and contribute with the Python, the Ruby community, Java, functional programming, different tech communities that are spawning all around the region. We are working on helping them, sponsor them, like showing how they can be better organizers. They are knowing each other. They come to maybe one of the conference we organize in Colombia, which is like a centralized place where all of these people meet. And from those events, more communities and more efforts are always being born in the country. So it's a beautiful effect. And also, what another thing we want to show is that it is a cycle. So this started like from one small event that I was part of, like as an attendee, Juan Pablo was organizing, and then we met and started like working together. Then Juan Pablo was in JSConf US in the Reunion family back in 2013, and from there we started JSConf Colombia, and JSConf Colombia inspired also others JSConf in Latin America. There is a force that are starting to appear and to work, not conferences that have consolidated yet in other parts of Latin America, but our objective is to help them and be able to establish like a framework to be able to let these other people in different parts of Latin America, not only Colombia, create something similar or even more powerful than the thing we did in our country.
Yeah, so I think from an infrastructural perspective, in countries like Colombia, where technology education is really far behind, right? The education that you get in college is dictated by the job market, and the job market is usually dictated by large companies that have huge contracts with the government or huge contract with banks, and that is the only professional experience that you can get. So unlike in the US, the role of being a technical programmer, or a software engineer, is considered blue collar, or it's more like labor than a prestigious software engineer here in the States. We believe that the only way to change this and to give access to folks to modern technologies, modern frameworks, modern experience is through communities. Communities are usually connected. They're always trying to experiment and share that knowledge. And we can, through these communities, run ahead of any other infrastructure that you may find. So you can go to a meetup in Medellin and learn about Vue.js, whereas in school and university, you will probably not even touch JavaScript at all, or any front-end tooling or processes. So in addition to building a community and sharing this knowledge, there is another intention to create an actual tech hub that is not driven by government funding or the industry. We do believe in open technologies. We do believe in the open web, and we believe that the only way we can take ownership of this is by giving access to people to this knowledge.
I love that. I mean, I feel like so much of the tech industry, there has been, the cutting edge has all been so centralized. For something that espouses decentralization and openness, we have a ridiculous amount of the cutting edge coming out of Silicon Valley, California, which, as much as I love Silicon Valley, is a very narrow window of humanity and has their own set of biases and a very clear bubble. And having this as something that is really accessible to folks worldwide is huge.
Yeah, and be able to take that quote unquote like Silicon Valley experience, or these Silicon Valley heroes, these people that you admire, that creates the libraries you use, that creates the technology you use, that they speak at the conference you want to attend. You know them by Twitter, by YouTube, and these are these like role models that are impossible. They must be like genius. You know the feeling I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Once we are able to close that gap and to create like a bridge between these two, like a developing nation and the hub of all of the innovation, which is Silicon Valley, once we bring these people to this country, or community is not seeing only their technical expertise, but they know, oh, these people are human that have the same fears, insecurities that I have. Maybe they grew up in with better opportunities or a privileged environment, and maybe not. You also know people that are like super famous in the JavaScript or tech community that you think are super privileged, and they also come from countries where they needed to do a lot of work to be able to earn that place and to overcome those biases and those fears. So those are part of the impact we also see the communities experiencing, is being in touch with these people, seeing that these people is just humans and they can be the same as them. This has created another culture of stop consuming products and start building products and start building technology. And we are starting seeing more people, not only in Colombia, but in Latin America, with amazing startups, with amazing ideas, libraries, books, doing a lot of things because they were able to overcome that barrier. And it is very, for us, it's powerful. At the beginning, we needed to bring these people to close those barriers. But right now, we will have a JSConf Colombia in November, and almost all the speakers that were selected are pretty much new names and new role models, new people that are like also having the experience to grow. So it's amazing. We are coming from these specific persons that had like the privilege to show that everybody can, and everybody can contribute, can grow, and it's part of the change and effect we have been working on, and believe it can be way more powerful.
So if you could summarize our talk, I'd say it shares how we've built a bridge, mostly a privilege bridge, right?
Yeah.
I was privileged enough to be in New York and have access to a very healthy tech community. And I was in a position where I could bridge New York and Colombia. And I was also in a privileged position that I could bridge my network, friends from local meetups, which like Brooklyn JS, like Manhattan JS, which are like world-renowned meetups, and invite them to speak in Bogota and in Medellin in exchange for, hey, I'll pay your ticket, I'll pay your hotel, come along. And what this ultimately gives us is, or the mission is to give people in developing nations, in developing places, the tools to solve their own problems, right? So I agree very much with you that there's a center of technology in Silicon Valley that is solving problems. But in many ways, Silicon Valley is solving problems, first world problems.
Yep, and even Silicon Valley problems, not even the rest of the first world.
Right. No, absolutely. And these don't apply. So it is great that it's like a research center for the world, because you get all this funding going towards the development of new technologies and new frameworks. Like the ability of taking some time to invent the JavaScript framework is amazing. And that's a privilege that working in the technology industry gives you, because it gives you free time that you can spend towards that. In Latin America, we are in survival mode, right? You can't really have that much time because we're trying to figure out how to survive. I think the income for a programmer in Colombia is an average of $1,500 a month. That's average, and it's probably a lot lower. That doesn't give you a lot of freedom to work on these interesting problems when you have to take care of your family, you have to take care of yourself. So instead of like seizing the means of production, it's more like seizing the means of prototyping and staging and giving people access to tools for them to solve their own problems.
I love it. So one question. Y'all are focused on JavaScript, but you also mentioned that you've connected with other communities. Was there anything about JavaScript in particular that made this really tick? Was there a reason for starting there, or just happened to be the communities that you were embedded in? Or
personally, in my experience, I've been part of other communities before. I tried to work or start the Linux community in Colombia back in 2001. Java community, those communities never did any click. And once I met like the JavaScript community, when I had the opportunity to interact with the JavaScript community in Colombia, there were like one community that were working based on the model that Juan Pablo knew in New York and in this privileged position he was. And when I was able to be part of the family, I knew that, my God, the JavaScript family is different. It's more welcoming. You feel like you belong to something, and the people inspire you to do these things. So not only we are not saying, okay, we alone created this huge beast in Latin America. We were also inspired by other people from the same community in other parts. So this butterfly effect that we are telling, it's from our point of view or point of perspective in Colombia, but we have received the same inspiration and knowledge from the whole JS family abroad. So yes. I would say that the JavaScript family per se, it's very special compared to other communities.
Absolutely. I think what Julián says is spot on. We are also recipients of like the butterfly effect that other people started. I personally did focus in JavaScript because of the community, but what predates this is when I got into technology around 2009. Before that, I was a line cook that run a kitchen in Fort Lauderdale. I had moved to the States 2007. The recession came along. I needed a job. I landed in the food industry, and I was there like making my way up in a kitchen. But I also always liked building websites, and I had learned HTML and CSS, and because I set up the MySpace for my band, and it was a hobby to learn. And I discovered the jQuery podcast where like Paul Irish and Rebecca Murphy and Adam Sontag and Alex Sexton, that predates a little bit this podcast. I would listen to them when I was closing the kitchen, and I would learn about like if statements and just a bunch of random stuff. And despite the fact that I was learning, I think it was Joomla and PHP, what I was actually building sites for people on, JavaScript kept calling me. And I heard about JSConf in that podcast the first time. Then they had a recap on like, oh, we went to JSConf, all these, and I was like learning about the internals of these community. I sort of felt that I knew each of them. And then the first JSConf I went, I met Adam. I also met Rebecca. Paul was there, and now more than someone who was like in my ears at a podcast years ago, they're folks who I consider friends.
That's great. Yeah, one of the things I love about podcasts is it really does create that connection. I've met multiple people here at JSConf that previously I knew because they were chiming in on our live Slack channel as we're doing the podcast. And it does create this incredible community effect. I'd like to explore a little bit more what you talked about in terms of bridging privilege, because this is a concept that I've been thinking about a lot, also being in a position of privilege. There's a great talk that I'm blanking on the spot about the speaker's name, but talking about lending privilege and how you can lend out privilege, particularly if you're in a place of privilege. And many folks, if you're listening to this podcast, if you are a white man in the tech industry, let me tell you, you have incredible privilege already, and you can lend that out. And you can, I'd like to explore this idea of bridging to privilege as well, because I think it's a slightly different take on this idea of lending privilege, but it's really powerful.
So the clearest example I can give you right now is the fact that anyone who speaks English is privileged enough to listen to this podcast and learn. But if you don't, you don't get access to that knowledge. And the only way to bridge it is by having access to those worlds, right? I speak Spanish, I speak English. I can take some time and translate this or interpret this to folks, and then immediately they get access, right? The unfortunate portion of the technology industry is that there's this concept like whoever comes first gets naming rights. Technology comes first from an English-speaking world, and everything that is interesting, or mostly everything that is interesting, has to be in English. And this leaves out so many people just because they were not born into a country that speaks that language, or into a country that supports you learning that language. And then it's like a cycle of how hard it is for you to get just the basic knowledge to get started a website, because most of the resources are not in a language that you grew into. The way we bridged it is from the first event that we launched in 2011, which was JSConf. We knew that we needed to have interpreters, because we understood that probably the majority of folks who would attend this event, it was 150 of them, would not be in a position to understand technical talks in English at the speed that they go. So we offered free interpretation.
That's actually a really interesting idea around, I wonder if there is any resource out there or just central clearing spot for folks who want to translate podcasts, posted talks, things like that, to make them accessible around the world.
I have seen personally efforts at the open source project level. For example, the Node.js project, it has like a very good work around the translation of the documentation and the project. They use like a platform and have like collaborative translation, but I don't see specifically like people going and translate a podcast, because it requires like audio production. So maybe yes, I can like, do captioning to a podcast if that works, but doing like the full translation to a podcast is difficult. But what if we start creating content in our language and we start targeting our people and closing the bridge? Normally, and we see the same people enter into technology and they want to be at the level that, like at an international level, and people from our community start publishing in English and start creating content in English, and we are leaving our people behind.
Yeah, because
we want to fit in this global tech community, but by trying to fit in, we are forgetting about our people and our language. Yes, I know we need to learn and we need to grow ourselves and get more skills, but how can we also close the gap and help others that doesn't have that privilege, or they are starting slowly and improve that skill, for example, which is language. And that's only one part. There's more other variables that are considered privilege in a country like Colombia. For example, we organize a conference, you want to attend, The conference is in the capital of the country. In order to get there, you need to pay a plane ticket or take a 8-9 hour bus ride if you want to make it cheap. You need to pay a ticket to go to the conference. Sadly, we try to make those tickets as much as affordable as possible, but we need to pay speakers. We need to pay for the conference. It requires a lot of money too.
Yeah.
So we need to charge a ticket, at least the most affordable one. But even though these people that want to attend and have talent, they don't have the money, they don't have the means, they don't have the resources. Also, from the beginning, we have created opportunity scholarships. So, okay, you want to come, at least take the ticket for free. I mean, while we were growing, getting more sponsorship, and even though ourselves sponsor the conference with our own money or education budget from our companies, we pass from, okay, I'm going to give you the entrance to the conference, but I will pay you to come here and I will give you a plane ticket. And it's beautiful to see in previous JSConf we have helped not only people in Colombia to benefit from the opportunity scholarships, but countries like Venezuela that are suffering right now and having like a social conflict, like a very bad social conflict.
Yeah.
We have benefited people from that country with not only the ticket to the conference, but with plane ticket, hotel, food. It's like a full scholarship. We have seen people that attended this conference doing the same in Venezuela, bringing the knowledge there. Even though they don't have the infrastructure, they have the passion and they're sharing knowledge and they're creating communities and they're like, it's the same effect.
Yeah.
But we want to work on be able to also pass that privilege to these communities so those communities can also grow and make a huge impact.
Yeah, so I'll answer your original translating question, and then I'll jump back with what Julián was saying. So there is a platform called TransFX where you can crowdsource translation for texts, and it's pretty useful. I've seen many communities use it. If you have good documentation, it is very likely that someone in a different language, usually Spanish, will start translating efforts in books and many other things. So documentation does start getting translated fairly common, but then tutorials don't. And finding tutorials that you can find a lot of basics in Spanish, for example. Once you start trying to find something a little bit more advanced, it gets very, very difficult. And also talks. There's not a huge culture of sharing what you learn at work outside. And also you're not always exposed to great like production challenges of how to scale 55 million requests. So you are limited by your own experience, which connects to what Julián is saying, because the moment that you can transcend the limitations and like get access to the global market of work as a software developer, because you have the skills, because you have the language, then everything changes and you get access to an income that you will very likely not have locally. And this does become a self-feeding cycle. What we do need to make sure is like folks who are able to transcend into this global market is that we pull people with us, right? So we started and have been dragging a little bit our feet on an initiative that's called Charla, which is an online hangout that gives access to advanced and mid-level content in Spanish over streaming to everyone who speaks Spanish. We have a few that have recorded. I think work has gotten in the way of us keeping up to date with this, and we definitely need to bring it back. But it's one of these things that we need to continue to sponsor and provide so that other folks can come along with us.
Yeah, I love the idea of accessing the global market and then bringing the community along. A number of years back, and I don't remember the name of it, but I ran into a group that they were based in a small town in Mexico, and they were doing Ruby on Rails consulting. And they had somebody living in the US who was being essentially a liaison. They were doing business development, finding things, and they would do consulting work, but then they were using this to fund a school and fund village it was a village of, I don't know, several thousand people, not very large, but they were bringing this prosperity that they had been able to access by accessing the global market and bringing it back to everyone who was there. And I think there's an incredibly powerful effect that we can unlock as more and more people become willing to engage with remote work, and the tooling is getting better to make that possible. The language is still a barrier, and having somebody who can liaison, or I think in that case what they would do is they had a set of essentially lead developers who spoke reasonably good English, who would form your primary bridge to English-speaking clients, and then junior developers who may or may not speak good English but could work with them and kind of access that through them.
That's amazing. Also, one of the things I love the most regarding this, the community coming back, we have seen members of our community that started with just attending a workshop, very young, 14, 15 years old, just attending a workshop, then being recipients of a scholarship for a conference, then they are working on our organizing group, then they got a super good job abroad and they are living in Amsterdam, working for a great company, doing great things, and sadly they can come back to the conference, but they start building bridges. And these same people that started like as attendees and worked with us and spoke at our conferences are contributing back. Right? They were able to have that salary increase, that change of career path, and they're seeing the fruits of that, and they're contributing back to the community through the opportunity scholarships. We have other members from a very disadvantaged region in Colombia that were able to break that wall. They're working for amazing companies out there, and they're contributing back to the region. They created a foundation. They are doing free boot camps for the young, for the out there in this region. Amazing work without any interest of profit. Like just they want to contribute and help the community the same way they were benefited by the community.
I think folks who grow up in a rich country have trouble grappling with the idea of how big of a difference that can make. I spent a while living in Guatemala, and you would wonder, you could go through the towns there and you could see which houses had someone living in the States, because they would be worlds nicer than the average quality house. And you say, oh, there's a remesa house. Remesa is the word for sending back. I know you guys know, but for our listeners, it's folks who send back money to the home country. In Spanish, it's una remesa. No. And you could pick it out visually. Oh, they have somebody who's in the States. They're able to afford a quality of life that otherwise is just inaccessible, particularly more remote places and poorer countries. I know Colombia is substantially richer than Guatemala, but it makes an incredible difference when we're able to make these connections from where you are sitting, if you're privileged in the US, back to some place that doesn't have those opportunities.
Yeah, Colombia is richer, but also there's a higher income inequality. Mm-hmm. I think Colombia is one of the top 5 countries in income inequality. There's a few folks who have a lot of it. So you can see a lot of the problems that are, or challenges or opportunities that Central America, Latin America, and even cities inside the states that are disconnected, that have been sort of like disenfranchised have. And it's one of the reasons why we're very big supporters of companies in the States, the companies that I work for example, building distributed teams in the States, in cities that are not tech hubs, and also in the Americas. I think we need to support each other.
Absolutely. And being able to be distributed all up and down the Americas is far easier than going overseas to India or some other typical outsourcing places, because you're in the same time zones. Yes. It's really not so hard.
It is good, but you have the challenge of infrastructure. For example, this conference I talked to you in this unprivileged region, it's basically forgotten by the government. They don't have infrastructure, a lot of corruption, a lot of talented people, passionate people. They want to do a lot of things. Infrastructure is kind of hard. We were at this conference. They were able to get like an amazing venue. More than 200 people attended to the conference. Almost all of the speakers that went to the conference, we sponsor our own trip and our own ticket to go there. I mean, we didn't ask the conference to bring us there. And there was somebody giving a talk, and power is out. No Wi-Fi, no projector, nothing. And it comes back in less than a minute. And everybody like shoot up, like, hey, let's come back. And for us was like curious, it was like a small thing. And we ask, why you are so excited? Oh no, it came very fast. Normally it takes 2 to 3 days to the power to come back. In that moment you say, okay, even though if these people have the opportunity to be working in a distributed team for a company abroad or wherever, they don't have the infrastructure to do it.
Yeah.
Because the same city are not guaranteeing power, internet. So it's hard in those contexts. It's very hard.
Absolutely. So for folks listening to this who have privilege in one form or another, and as you highlight, if you're listening to this in English, you have a form of privilege. If they want to do something about it, what are your thoughts, having been there, having been through this experience of bridging folks? What can people do?
Give your money away. Literally. Like, if you're not a member from an underprivileged population, mentorship doesn't work because you don't understand the challenges. The context is completely gone. But you have money. You have tech money. So give that tech money away to any event that is outside of a tech hub. So like, hey, I just want to sponsor one opportunity scholarship. That goes a lot further than anything else.
And money goes a lot further in places that aren't as bloody expensive as Silicon Valley.
Yes, to some extent. So I think Julián was this is something we'll cover a little bit in our talk, but Julián was saying that we have two challenges. One of them is we need to keep our events affordable for the local population. If you are a person who makes $1,000, $1,500 a month as your income, and you have a family and all these things, you really can't afford anything past $200, which is a ton. That's a lot of money. On the other hand, the cost structure for a conference in Colombia is very similar to one in the States. I know because I was a part of the organizing team for Empire.js in New York, and I'm also the founder of JSConf Colombia. So I think there's a $20K, $30K difference in cost structure, but local sponsorships are impossible to get. Companies initially don't believe that you need the money, that you're going to spend it for something else. They don't want to give it to you. So that's really, really limiting. And you can't charge people locally. So you have to come up with creative ways to cut costs. For example, we don't give food at our events, like lunch or like actual meals. We give snacks because food is one of the most expensive things for a conference to offer. We do pay all our speakers for trips from anywhere in the world, and we put them up in a really nice hotel because they become our ambassadors. That means that we need to come here in the States, and all our friends who work at big companies are like, hey, can you put me in touch with your sponsor, like whoever handles marketing? We are like, it's unlikely you're going to hire anyone in Colombia. You probably don't see us as a place where you market your services or your product or anything, but we can really use the money. Can you do us a favor?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Awesome. This has been really fun. Anything else you guys want to talk about or bring up in this?
You should come to Colombia, right? We have this conference once a year. It sells out as fast as JSConf US, which is amazing. If it sells out this fast next year, we may consider expanding our venue and like welcoming more folks. So you should stop by and visit us.
Yeah, maybe we can get a JS Party representative down there. I'd love to come visit.
JS Fiesta, that sounds good. So jsconf.co.
All right, I'm checking it out right now because I don't know if I can make it time-wise, but I would love to be there.
November 16, 17, Medellin, Colombia. It's an amazing conference, an amazing city, and definitely you will have a lot of fun and learn a lot. And you can see with your own eyes the beautifulness of Colombia, and
yeah,
you will fall in love for sure.
Speaking as someone who grew up in the States and has visited a number of countries in Latin America, though not Colombia, it will change your worldview. It is an incredible thing to do. If you have not spent time in Latin America, do yourself a favor and get down there, because it will just open your eyes to so many things that you take for granted that are not true, some of them good, some of them bad. And in my experience, it really has shifted the way that I live my life. So definitely recommend.
So I have some pretty awesome news to share. We are now partnered with Algolia. If you've ever searched Hacker News, Teespring, Medium, Twitch, or even Product Hunt, then you've experienced the results of Algolia's search API. And as we expand our content, we knew that one day we'd have to either roll our own search solution on top of Postgres, or we could partner up with Algolia. And I'm happy to report that phase 1 of our search is now powered by Algolia. We're able to fine-tune our indexing, gain insights from search patterns and analytics. We can create custom query rules to influence ranking behavior, as well as improve our search experience by adding synonyms and alternative corrections to queries. Sure, we could build search ourselves, but that would mean we would be busy doing that instead of shipping shows like you're listening to right now. Huge thanks to our friends at Algolia for working with us. Check the show notes for a link to get started for free, or learn more by heading to algolia.com. And by NativeScript. NativeScript is an open source framework for building truly native mobile apps for iOS and Android using JavaScript and TypeScript with frameworks like Angular and Vue. And in this segment, I'll talk with TJ Van Tol from the NativeScript team about why people should care about NativeScript.
Thanks, Adam. So I'll give you 3 quick reasons. First, NativeScript is just a great way to get into iOS and Android development if you're coming from a JavaScript background. You get to use a lot of the tech you might already know when you're building NativeScript apps. So using things like CSS, NPM, Webpack, and of course, JavaScript. Second, with NativeScript, we let you build performant apps. With NativeScript, we're rendering your apps using native user interface components, so we don't use web views in any way. So your apps are really snappy and they feel great when your users use them. And finally, in NativeScript, we support both Angular and Vue.js. So if you're already using those frameworks on the web, I think you'll find it's just a lot of fun to use a framework you already know and to create native iOS and Android apps using that same tech stack.
All right, if you want to learn more about NativeScript and you like what TJ had to say about NativeScript and what it has to offer you when building mobile apps for iOS and Android, head to nativescript.org/JSParty. Once again, nativescript.org/JSParty.
Tim Doherty is a staff engineer at Procore Technologies and a longtime member of the JavaScript community. We had a great discussion about technology adoption at larger companies, how to use the concept of innovation debt to advocate for modern technology stacks, and how to foster mentorship in the community. Now you're speaking just after we talk here. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your talk?
Sure. I'm giving a talk entitled ES6 in Practice. And the gist of it is that, 3 years later, after the spec's been finalized, browsers are up to speed. But a lot of teams have barely scratched the surface in terms of what you can do with this major update to the language. A lot of it is limited to syntactic sugar. And while all of those enhancements are nice, they're not where the real meat and potatoes lie. And so the talk is equal parts a dive into what I think are the important parts of ES6 and how they've played out over the past 3 years, and also sort of an entertaining case study on how I learned and then championed ES6 for an enterprise software company.
Nice. So any sneak peeks? What are the key features in your mind?
I think everybody loves the object literal enhancements. Everyone loves template literals and arrow functions and all of that good syntactic sugar. The real meaty stuff, in my opinion, are the entirely new features: generators, proxies, symbols, things like that. And then there's some controversial stuff, the most egregious of which being classes. And one of the key points of my talk is that 3 years later, JavaScript still does not have classes. It's just syntactical sugar.
Yeah. The JavaScript class syntax is still the prototype model.
It is indeed.
There are arguments for and against, but certainly we should be aware of the fact that that's what it is.
Absolutely. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm not one of these people that hates classes. There's a reason for their existence. I actually admire the terseness of the syntax. It just would have been nice if they could have figured out a way to do so without bringing in the class-based OO metaphor, because it trips up the very same developers who they were trying to court and make the syntax more approachable for.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about your experience evangelizing this. It sounds like doing that inside of an enterprise company. I know a lot of enterprise companies tend to be a little slow on the adoption side. I've done some work with folks who are working on apps that were essentially started 10 years ago and have barely been updated. They're updated for features, but in terms of the technologies being used, not updated. So how did that go?
It's always a tenuous process. Enterprise software companies, in our case, we're publicly owned, and so we had a responsibility to be conservative to a certain extent. But at the same time, when we're talking about technology and a technology-based company, you can't afford to fall behind. You get innovation debt, which is something that's not usually recognized. And that manifests itself not just in how fast your team can react to changes in the ecosystem, but also from a pure business perspective, the recruiting efforts. It's really hard to position yourself in a competitive market when you're using outdated frameworks and technologies. So I was part of an enterprise software architecture committee that met once every 2 weeks, and new ideas, new technologies had to be voted on by the committee. You made your case, you backed it up with data and numbers and cogent arguments, and then the committee voted on it. So in some ways this was easier than other challenges, simply because it's an update to the language itself and not a framework du jour that's going to fade out of existence. But yet there was a lot of dubious kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around it. The committee's made up mostly of current and former back-end developers, and I can empathize. I was one myself for many years.
Yep.
And so I came to the table with sort of these tried and true guarantees. It's a spec that's finalized. This will be part of the language. It's going to be here for a long time to come. A lot of the pushback was around the timing of it, adopting this prior to browsers having implemented it. And there was the reassurance that the community at large is doing it. We're in a world now where transpilers are just part of our build chain.
Yep.
And as long as features have made it past like a stage 3 proposal, it's pretty safe to use them in production.
Absolutely.
And so eventually I was able to sort of wear them down with enough data and enough analysis that people actually are using these tools in production, and that it was safe for us to move ahead.
I like the idea that you just sort of touched on there of innovation debt, because we hear a lot about technology debt, right? Code debt. We talk about actual debt and various things, but can you explore that concept a little bit more and how it plays out?
Absolutely, and so it actually ties into something I'm doing right now at Procore. Procore is an amazing company to work for, by the way, and we're always looking for great people, so I encourage anyone that's here at the conference to come and talk to me about opportunities we have. But one of the things they allowed us to do as an organization, as an R&D organization, was to crowdsource what we thought were the most important problems to tackle in the next fiscal year. And I championed debt in all of its forms. There's technical debt that everybody understands, problems with the code that surface later as interest on that unpaid debt. One of the less recognized forms of debt, though, is innovation debt, right? And so innovation debt happens when you fail to stay abreast of changes in technology, changes in process that can improve the way you do work. And it's usually, like other forms of debt in R&D, it usually comes to a head in a really egregious way. Like, for example, you now have a 5-year-old code base, a 10-year-old code base even, that no developer in their right mind wants to touch, including the people you have on board. And so what happens is, almost invariably, the good people you have leave to pursue other opportunities where they can work with later and greater technologies, and your recruiting efforts come to a standstill. So aside from the fact that often the technologies and processes bring in and of themselves benefits, tangible benefits. I mean, the reason why frameworks iterate, the reason why new ones come about is they solve a problem better than others do, right? So you not only do you lose that, but you end up with a team then that can barely stay ahead of their own code.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've seen that in some of the places I go in to train folks, and the team's frustrated. And they can see what's going on. Like, folks, even if you've been at the same company for 10 years working on this product, like, you can see what's happening in the ecosystem, and you want a piece of that.
It's challenging, and this is one of the things I think, especially if you are a tech company, if you are a software company, it is really important to walk the walk. You can't just tell people they'll be working with the latest and greatest. You have to make a commitment to your team and to your recruitment efforts to stay ahead, to stay latest and greatest within reason. And there's obviously constraints around every team, and if you're publicly traded, you may have to be a little bit more conservative than otherwise, but it's really important to stay abreast and stay ahead.
Does this play out? So you mentioned the human cost with your existing team. You mentioned the recruiting costs, and obviously the benefits of all these years of technology advancements. Are there other ways you've seen innovation debt play out?
Sure, and one of them is, I know the Rails framework is a really popular framework for Ruby shops. Procore is a Ruby shop. We've managed to stay relatively current, but I have heard through colleagues that have worked at other companies, other Rails shops, horror stories of the innovation debt getting so bad they've stayed on an older version of Rails and haven't wanted to migrate, that they've actually forked it and then maintained their own version with the various security patches that are published by the Rails community. And there you have a combination of innovation debt and technical debt.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It becomes untenuous. They spend so much time maintaining that fork of the framework that their feature work comes to a stop.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. JavaScript world, I mean, Rails has been around as a framework for, 10, 12 years now. JavaScript world, I don't know if anything's lasted that long. Maybe Dojo.
We have Dojo just released version 2, I think, after all of these years. It's quite remarkable. And Dojo we have to thank for many of the innovations that we take for granted today. I mean, the first module system really came out of Dojo, which later became, James Burke wrote the AMD specification and required JS out of that work.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Dojo already did that as a meme, right? It goes around. Actually, Dylan from Dojo is doing a talk that is React already did that, kind of
very nice.
Trying to play on that
I'll have to check that one out.
But there's definitely, that's really interesting. So I'm curious then to learn a little bit more about how you get out of innovation debt. This seems like something that you've thought about a lot, you've grappled with internally. What's the pathway out?
Yeah, and so, I have some experience. This will be my 23rd year in software engineering in one form or another. I've been at Procore going on a year now, and there's various different ways to tackle this problem. And you kind of have to divide it into your current situation, cataloging your existing debt and figuring out how to repay that, and then you look at how do you be a little smarter about not incurring debt going forward. So as far as the existing debt, there are some tools available to us. Lori Voss just mentioned that NPM now has audit built in that will look at security vulnerabilities. There's also outdated that will show you the delta between what you have and what the latest version is. And there are tools, there's a great tool called Dependabot that will actually open a PR for you and tell you that your version is outdated. The nice thing about that is it nudges you into action, but a human has to decide whether or not, especially if it's a major version, if the risk is high. And so you have to slice and dice those and figure out and prioritize when you can tackle your existing debt. And then going forward, it's up to your organization to make a commitment to stay on the latest stable version of a framework. And that means that the delta between each update is nominal. You can use semver ranges and things like that just to automatically stay up to date with minor versions, and then you make that commitment to do the work that's required to stay on the latest major. It just requires a little due diligence at the end of the day.
So have you found folks on the business side to be receptive to the concept?
I have, partly because my personality style is one, and I've cultivated this over my career, is that I'm not afraid just to walk up to executives and bend their ear. And also, as part of this initiative, the leadership of our organization made it very clear that their doors were open. And so I just jumped right in on that. The hardest nut to crack was the product organization, which is almost always the case. They're focused on delivering features. They're focused on customer value. And so translating what is often a technical problem into something that product can digest I knew was going to be the hardest. I did manage to get a lunch with our senior VP of product and talked him through this all kind of in layman's terms. And there were a few lights that came on then. And then I had a unique confluence of events where we had this customer summit where we had, these customers came and talked about things that were highest priority for them. And we looked at a bunch of backlog items, and lots of these were small debt items, especially UX debt, things like the delta between what customers expect and what we deliver. And I had the SVP of product reach out to me on Slack during the event and say, I think I get it. Like that, we had this thing come up in one of our customer support calls, and I think that's UX debt. I want to follow up with you. Let's get some time on the calendar when you get back from JSConf and talk about it. And so, I'm actually changing minds and getting buy-in from the people that really need to buy into it, which is the business side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing that we as technical people, sometimes we have to learn painfully over the course of a career, is you need to start with the pain that they are feeling. And for the product organization, design organization, it's probably pain in terms of, I want these user experience things to happen and it takes forever to do it, or it's really hard to do it, or it never comes out quite right. And you can kind of talk them through this conversation of, the reason this is hard to do is that we're on 5 generations old of JavaScript and we can't do this type of thing.
And also, some of the smaller issues, which in isolation seem like not such a big deal, get deprioritized in favor of shiny new features. And then all of a sudden, one of your customers experiences 5 or 10 of those things all in one session, and the effect is devastating from a credibility perspective. And so I think that's where I was really able to flip the switch with Brandon and get this thing rolling from his perspective. So
you talked about ES6 as one area where you're doing this, and we say ES6, but it's really modern JavaScript. Like there was this big gap, then we had ES6, and now we've got all these kind of rolling 1 per year new specs coming out, stuff getting modernized. Some of the features you mentioned, I think, were not in the first ES6, but actually a couple of the later versions of this. What are some other areas where you are tackling innovation debt, and where you've seen these things making a big difference if you can bring them on board?
We are very much a React shop, so the whole ecosystem that surrounds it, Redux and various abstractions on top of that, like the various side effect libraries. I found recently that a huge portion of our code base was using an outdated version of Redux Loop, which is an async side effect handling library. And I was able to convince from the ground up developers just to opt in. And the way I did that, another area of tech debt that I think is often unaddressed is test coverage. We saw in Lori's talk on stats from NPM that something like 21% of NPM users, 10 million users, have no testing at all. To me, that's like, I can't fathom that at this point in my career. But again, I've been around for a while. Right. And so I actually had one of these younger developers that was tackling this problem work on a tool that I had written from the ground up with TDD, and show him how much safer and easier it is to swap out a new version of a library with a slightly different API when there's tests to back it up. Right? That's safe, the red-green refactor. And often it's a matter of fear. People are afraid to take that leap, and they feel part of that's cultural. You have to have a culture that allows people to fail and very quickly fix their mistakes. And the other is to show them that there's techniques we can use to make those failures a lot less and a lot less often.
Yeah, I think early on, well, it's hard to say early on because JavaScript has been around for so long, but for a very long time, the testing solutions in JavaScript were poor. But we're not in that boat anymore. We've actually got some very good testing solutions out there, and doing TDD JavaScript across the board is much more achievable now.
It is, and in fact, like most of the tooling in the JavaScript ecosystem, it's grown up very quickly, and we're now seeing some of the most sophisticated tooling of any stack happening in the web platform. The debuggers are outstanding. They're very advanced. The testing tooling, particularly Jest from Facebook, there's no excuse anymore not to do it. And so I'm very much a mentor and an evangelist. I'm giving a course at work actually on front-end test-driven development to demystify all of this stuff and show people that it's actually not that hard, that the bigger leap is probably getting into the mindset of test first, not the tools themselves. The tools are robust and very fast.
That's actually another area that I've been talking with folks about, and I'd be interested to explore with you. So many of the people that I have talked with have highlighted that we as an industry have a bit of a mentorship gap. As the industry started to blow up with the most recent round of big tech companies, there was a reaction of, we've got to have all these boot camps to help people get into the industry. And as a result, we have a glut of entry-level folks, but we don't globally do very well at getting people from, I'm entry level or 1 or 2 years, to how do I progress to become a more and more senior developer? It sounds like you've got some systems in place within the company. Can you talk a little bit about how those work and your experience both there and other places in terms of mentorship?
Absolutely. And so that's been something that I've very much focused on in my career. I had some people early in my career that took me under their wing and helped me grow as a developer, and I've wanted to give back ever since. And I really enjoy learning because learning benefits not just the student but also the teacher. If you want to learn something, the best way to learn it is to teach it. And so at Procore, they're very much a learning organization. So we have funding from the state of California for structured education programs, and we also do lots of informal sort of trainings on the job. We have lunch and learns at least once a week. We have these formal Dev Academy courses. The TDD one that I'm teaching is coming up in September. The organization very much focuses on the growth and development of its employees, and so we encourage pair programming, mob programming, all sorts of things that should encourage younger developers to learn from those who have been around for some time. And then personally, I took over stewardship of Santa Barbara JavaScript meetup about 4 years ago. It was languishing like meetups are apt to do.
They tend to do, yeah.
People take on a responsibility and don't realize what's actually involved in running a meetup.
Or life changes, right?
Exactly.
I started a meetup and ran it for 3 years, and then I had kids, and I was like, well, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, so I've got 2 kids and a stepson, and I'm also president of Paradise Dive Club in Santa Barbara, and I work full time.
All right,
and I run Santa Barbara JavaScript.
What's your secret?
Yeah.
What's your secret?
What's your excuse? No, I'm totally kidding. But when I took over that meetup, there were 2 things that I had in mind. First and foremost was to create a community in Santa Barbara for the local JavaScript community that was safe, and that no topic was out of bounds, and that people could come, younger, inexperienced people could come and ask any questions they want without feeling like they're being ridiculed, right?
Right.
And then the second was to provide the opportunity for people to connect from a mentor-mentee relationship as well as an employer-employee relationship. And so we've had some really successful couplings of people finding jobs and people finding tutors and these kinds of things. And the community now, 4 years later, is thriving.
That's the idea of deliberately focusing on connecting mentors and mentees is a good one. And it's one I wish I'd known when I started San Diego JavaScript, back in 2011 or whatever it was. Because we had a focus early on, getting everybody able to speak and connecting employers and employees. It was a smaller tech scene at the time, or particularly front-end web scene.
Yeah.
So we always had, who's hiring, who's looking for work, things like that. But I think if you're running a meetup, having just a brief section of who's looking for mentorship, who's willing or interested in mentoring, and just having that as it doesn't take long, a minute at the beginning or end of a meeting. That's all we usually did for hiring, is we'd say, who's hiring, who's looking to hire? Okay, everybody who's raised their hand, go find one of the other folks.
Yeah,
right?
if I can cross over to my other major passion, which is scuba diving, every time you're on a dive boat, that's the first thing they ask, who needs a buddy? Right? And then those people that came single and don't have a buddy, you mentor them up, right? And you get them out diving together.
It's so key, and that can fill some of that gap, because certainly there are plenty of folks out there who want to teach, who are happy to teach, who are happy to help you out, especially for motivated folks. This is something that I don't know how exactly you bridge in a meetup. I've found folks will reach out to me and say, hey, I want to mentor. And I'm like, great, what are you, I'm willing to mentor folks, but what have you done so far? What have you tried? What are you stuck on? What are you trying to work? Oh, I'm just getting started. I haven't checked anything out.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what you want me to do for you. A lot of this is online, you just got to start. Whereas you come into a mentor and you say, hey, I've got a question. Can you help me? I've been trying to figure this out and I'm stuck. Almost, I won't say anybody, but very large numbers of senior folks will happily sit down and help you figure out a specific problem. And if you continue to show interest and excitement, I've got a couple folks that I mentor regularly based on that. And it comes from showing commitment and trying to do it yourself, but also being willing to ask for help.
Absolutely. And I even take that one step further, both at work and outside, in that if there's an area that I'm passionate about, like test-driven development, for example, I will actively pursue people. We have the code base there at Procore. It's a younger organization, and so the front-end test coverage isn't where I'd like it to be. Yeah. And so I've basically just gone and identified tools with lower test coverage and then just approached those folks directly and said, hey, are you guys interested in learning how to write tests and write good tests and bump your code coverage up? And then I take an active role in getting the mentees to come to me. And then the other thing that we've done with the JavaScript meetup, in addition to the monthly talks where we have someone stand up and talk about something, is we've done these kind of pair in the pub things. One of my co-organizer, they have a little pub in their startup, and we just get people, tell them to bring their laptops and a problem they're working on, and we're there for them to help them work through things. And so to your point, that's a great way to have a focused conversation and get them started.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, every time you do that as a mentor, you'll learn something.
Oh, yeah.
Folks will ask a question and it'll twist the way you've been thinking about it, and you'll learn something new, even if it's something you've been doing for 20 years.
Sure. Well, as I'll cover in my talk, I've been following the spec for a little while as ES6 was coming to fruition, and I was really interested in going deep and learning it myself. And so I went and put together a 3-part series of talks and hands-on test-driven coding exercises that explored the entire surface area of the spec, everything in ES6, and that forced me to get up in front of people and know my before I actually started opening my mouth and talking about it. Yeah. And then I was able to sit with people with their laptops and walk them through, this is how it actually works. And that's where the real learning happens, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of JS Party. A big thank you to Derek and Gage, who made it possible for us to be at JSConf. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more about them at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Assuming you're loving this show, go rate, review, or recommend it wherever you get your podcasts. JS Party is edited and mixed by my man Tim Smith, and the beats are from the one and only Breakmaster Cylinder. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.